I'm Kerry Sautner from the National Constitution Center, and we are so happy to have you all on today. Today's lesson is going to be about the First Amendment, and it's going to focus on assembly and petition, which are two really important parts of the First Amendment. And at the end of today, we want to make sure that you guys know how important they were and how important they are. And I think it's a little poetic, though, that we're all assembling online today and in a different meaning of assembly. And that's what we're going to ask Jeff all about. What is the assembly and petition? What did it mean to the founding fathers? Where did they get their ideas from? What did it mean during the Reconstruction time period and Civil War? And then what does it mean today to assemble in the time of coronavirus? What does it mean today for petitions with online technologies? So we have a lot to go through. We have 45 minutes to do that. So hold on and get ready to ask questions. I'm going to use two things today. I'm going to use that chat function to ask you guys questions, and you're going to use the Q&A function to ask Jeff questions. So my job is pretty much done now. All I have to do is make sure I get your brilliant questions to Jeff. But I am going to turn it over to Jeff now to talk a little bit about not just the Constitution Center, but that really important First Amendment. Jeff, all you.
Thank you so much, Kerry. And it is indeed great to assemble virtually to talk about the First Amendment guarantees of assembly and petition. Friends, when we think about the First Amendment, often we think about the free speech clause or the free press clause. Or last week we talked about religion clauses. But these petition and assembly clauses are so important, and it's great to talk about them today. And they're relevant. So there's something going on right now implicating the petition and assembly clauses. There is a pastor in Florida who claims that a Florida order that all gatherings of more than 50 people stopped during the corona period violates his rights and those of his petitioners under the assembly clauses and the free exercise of religion clauses. And he says that stopping churches from assembling in order to exercise their worship services is a violation of those rights. So let's read the assembly and petition clauses, and then I'm going to ask you to vote about whether you believe, based on the text of what I've just read, you think that it's a violation of the First Amendment rights of assembly to ban all gatherings of more than 50 people, including churches. And then we'll have a discussion. We have so much to learn together, and then we'll vote again and see if you've changed your mind. Okay, here's the text of the First Amendment. It's always so important to begin with the text, and here it is. Congress shall make no law abridging the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That is the text, and what we're going to start with is the assembly clause. Congress shall make no law abridging the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and that's followed by the petition clause, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Do you believe that the state of Florida, which is bound by the First Amendment, violated the assembly clause, the right of the people peaceably to assemble, when a group of people wanted to assemble to exercise their religious worships, and the governor said, you can't do that because we have a corona crisis going on? And as you vote, I want you to separate your political from your constitutional views. In other words, I'm not asking you whether you think it's a wise idea for the governor to ban public gatherings. Maybe you think it's a great idea for public health, but whether the Constitution allows or forbids it. So you might think it's a good idea to ban the gatherings, but the assembly clause doesn't allow him to do those bans. Or you could think it's not a great idea, but the assembly clause permits those bans. So if you think that the Constitution allows the governor to ban churches from gathering during the corona crisis, vote yes. And if you think it does not, then vote no.
And I need to remind everybody that these sessions are interactive. So get on that chat box. Okay, now they're moving. I'll put the questions in there, and then we want to hear back from you. We want your questions. We want your answers, and they're rolling in now. But we are absolutely going to keep you on your toes, people. So lots of questions, lots of interaction. And again, this is what helps us still have conversations around the Constitution, have civil dialogues, and be socially distancing without cutting down our social interaction around the Constitution.
Absolutely. I love these answers. Rebecca says pastor can use his redress of grievances to sue the state. That's
Nice.
a wonderful suggestion, Rebecca. You think it is a violation of the assembly clause, and the petition clause might allow him to object. Martha agrees. The right is absolute. The government, during this time, the government may restrict rights to protect the population. No right is absolute. So Martha is saying that it's okay for the government to restrict rights to protect the population, as does Rodolfo. And we're getting a lot of yeses and nos, and then this very thoughtful response from Yolanda, context matters. So depending on the circumstances, it can.
And there's another one here in the Q&A from Phil. No, under the state police power. So no, they're not allowed to. However, it must be time limited. I thought that was really interesting, Phil.
Beautiful, Phil. That completely puts your finger on the central test that the Supreme Court has identified, that restrictions on any First Amendment right, including that of assembly and petition, may be valid if they are limited in time, place, and manner. That is the test from a Supreme Court case called O'Brien. And that means that you can't have a ban that lasts forever, the way Mr. Orban has just attempted to do in Italy, where he's banned all public assemblies and all elections indefinitely. That would not be permissible in America. Time, place, you may be able to ban gatherings of more than 50 people, but you can't ban all gatherings of 2 people in their homes. And manner, you can have exceptions for urgent activities like buying groceries. And that observation turns out to be crucial to identifying whether or not this ban is okay. If the governor had merely banned religious worship, but allowed other kinds of gatherings like huge concerts in stadiums, that would be problematic. It would not be content neutral. It would be discriminatory on the basis of viewpoint, and that's impermissible under the First Amendment. But broadly, those of you who said that probably the government can issue a temporary ban on all gatherings of more than 50 people, the law supports that position. And one case that is relevant, we talked about on a recent We the People podcast, which I urge you to check out if you want more details. It was a case called the Jacobsen Case, and there was a yellow fever epidemic in the US in the 1890s and early 20th century. And the state of Massachusetts wanted to have compulsory vaccinations, saying anyone who wasn't vaccinated would be threatening the health of others. A group of people said, we don't want to take the vaccination. It offends our religious scruples, and it also offends our bodily integrity to be forced to have a needle inserted into our bodies. And the Supreme Court said, you may be forced to be vaccinated because you're endangering the public health of others by refusing the vaccination. So with that precedent, along with others that give the states broad police power, and that's exactly the right phrase that several of you mentioned, it's likely that this Florida ban will survive. But if it lasts for a really long time and churches are suffering disproportionately, that would be another matter. Okay, wonderful. We've introduced a current case. It's happened last week, so you can see how relevant it is for us to gather together today to learn. And we've read the text. Now I'd love to tell you about the history of the petition and assembly clauses. But Kerry, do you have any questions before that?
Yeah, I think that it's great. Real quick for everybody that's asking, I will send you a list and links to every single court case Jeff mentions really quickly, because I know everybody loves the cases. So I'm going to reply to all of the emails that registered, and I will send you a full list. So don't worry, I will get them to you. You don't have to stress. This is for fun and for our, awakening our brains and thinking. And so I will be your note taker for this. So yeah, Jeff, I think it's really important to think about these. What does assembly mean? What does petition mean? What are grievances? All these ideas, but then go back to, and what did it mean in the time of the United States founding, in the time of writing We the People? What did it mean? So in different times, the meanings have been a little different. So it would be great to think, where did they come up with the ideas? Where did they get the ideas from? And why did they want to put them into our Constitution?
Absolutely. It's so exciting to study history. You get to hear thrilling stories about people who fought for their liberties. It's a great way to remember the meaning of these abstract phrases. And behind every constitutional clause, there's at least one really compelling story that is helpful to begin with. So I've got a story for the assembly clause and a story for the petition clause. The story for the Assembly Clause has to do with a man called William Penn, which people who live in Philadelphia know because he sits on top of City Hall, this great statue of William Penn, which was once the highest point in the whole city. And he was a Quaker. He was the founder of Pennsylvania, but he was tried in England for trying to hold a Quaker meeting, much like the pastor in Florida who was arrested last week. England at the time had an official religion, the Church of England, headed by the king. In fact, it still has an official religion, and the Queen, who gave that very moving address on YouTube just a few days ago, is still the head of the established Church of England. But in those days, England had a law that banned religious assembly of over 5 people outside the official church. It sounds a little like the quarantine law, except here it was clearly content discriminatory because you could gather inside the official church, but not more than 5 people outside of it. So Penn is arrested for holding a Quaker meeting in violation of the law. He was just preaching his Quaker faith in public. He defied the royal judge, and a jury initially refused to punish him for unlawful assembly, even though he was obviously guilty under the letter of the law. The jury was engaging in a kind of jury nullification because it thought that his religious rights and his rights of assembly were being violated. The judge then imprisoned members of the jury overnight without food or water, and he threatened to keep them there until they convicted William Penn. And at that point, William Penn shouted something very memorable to the jury. He shouted, "You are Englishmen, mind your privilege, give not away your right." Yesterday, I was telling this story, and I was trying to think of a way of remembering the phrase, mind your privilege. And I thought of this very loud, scary announcement that comes on if you're in London today and ride the subway. It's called the Tube. When the doors open, this booming voice comes out and says, "Mind the gap." And what that means is there's a gap between the subway car and the platform. And they're saying, don't fall into that gap, mind the gap. So anytime you want to remember the story of William Penn, think, mind the gap, mind your privilege, and give not away your right. And that is a great slogan for all of us, to mind our privilege and give not away our rights. And what's the best way to mind our privileges and secure our rights? Well, it's to learn about them, which is exactly what you're doing right now. And that's why our time together is important. So the judge then had to fine the jury for contempt of court because they still wouldn't say that he was guilty. And he sent them to prison until they paid the fine. And one of the jurors challenged this move and finally won in the Court of Common Pleas, which concluded a judge may not imprison a jury for refusing the way the judge would like. So that is a great example of a story of assembly, of religious assembly, that inspired the framers of the First Amendment and helped them write the right of assembly into the Constitution. Okay, I'm going to pause there before telling the story of the Petition Clause. Kerry, any questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the questions around assembly and looking at William Penn, so for so many reasons, was it because of the ability to assemble because of your religious beliefs that we brought that into the American Constitution? But then I also think about, and this is my favorite story around this, about the Liberty Tree and like how the colonists were not allowed to assemble and had to hide around the Liberty trees to assemble to have discussions about what they believed in. So is it a mixture between religious freedoms and just overall freedoms for the colonists at the time, and then therefore into our Constitution?
Absolutely. Religious freedoms are by no means the only rights that are protected by the rights of assembly. All of our rights are protected when we mind our privilege and give not away our rights by assembling, unless we can talk together, reason together, discuss, as we are doing right now, virtually. If we were not allowed virtually to assemble, we would not be able to learn about our rights, and therefore we wouldn't be able to defend them. And there are all sorts of examples of really important assemblies of the colonists during the Revolutionary era. They gathered the Sons of Liberty to denounce the writs of assistance in Boston after the Boston Tea Party that sparked the American Revolution. They assembled to object to other intolerable acts. And of course, they assembled to debate and discuss the ratification of the Constitution itself. So religious freedom was just one of the many rights that are protected by the right of assembly. And it is impossible for we the people to protect our rights unless we can assemble to discuss them.
And on that note, if they're assembling, these two go hand in hand, right? It's assembly and petition. They feel so connected for me. And I know they can be separated as well. But when I think about the colonists assembling, I go right to probably our biggest petition ever in America, right?
Absolutely. The biggest petition ever in America was, as Kerry suggests, no, it's my mind goes to it as well. It's the Declaration of Independence. I mean, what more dramatic example is there of a petition to the king saying, here is all the ways that you have violated our natural rights, the rights that inhere in us, that come from God or nature, not from government, and that you have tyrannically abridged. And the Declaration of Independence was picking up on a long tradition of petitions in the founding era, both those that objected to those various earlier acts of the king, the intolerable acts and the writs of assistance. It also picked up on petitions to state legislatures, such as James Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance, passed in 1785 when Patrick Henry, if you guys were with us during the religious freedom conversations last week, remember that Patrick Henry wanted to issue a tax in Virginia for anyone who didn't pay a certain amount of money to support the established Anglican Church. And Madison wrote this soaringly beautiful and powerful petition called the Memorial and Remonstrance, objecting that these taxes violated the natural rights of conscience, which he said were unalienable, because I can't alienate or surrender to Kerry or to you or to anyone else the power to control my thoughts and opinions, because I can't control them of my reasoning mind. No other person can exercise jurisdiction over any of our thoughts. So lots of people signed that Madison Memorial and Remonstrance, and it was a famous petition. But what's really exciting and important about the rights of petition is that they were exercised very powerfully over a central question, the central injustice of the framing era, and that was slavery. As early as 1777, Benjamin Franklin, who had become an abolitionist, that is, someone who wants to abolish slavery, filed a petition. And it was offered for freedom to the Massachusetts House on behalf of 7 African Americans. That petition was offered by a man called Prince Hall, and it drew on the Declaration of Independence. It argued that slavery violates natural law. It was one of many petitions brought in Massachusetts during the American Revolution to destroy slavery. Benjamin Franklin offered other such petitions, and his was offered in 1790. It was an anti-slavery petition from the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. It was offered to Congress. Pennsylvania had the first abolitionist society in the country. The Quakers took a lead role. Isn't that an interesting connection between William Penn, the Quaker in 17th century England, exercising his religious freedom rights, and Benjamin Franklin on behalf of the Quaker society, the Anti-Slavery Society, petitioning Congress. And in one of his final public acts, Franklin sent the petition, signed in February 1790, to Congress on behalf of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, calling for the abolition of slavery and end of the slave trade. And here's what the petition read. He quotes language from that evokes the Declaration of Independence. It's very moving, so listen to it. The petition said that mankind are all formed by the same almighty being, alike objects of his care, and equally designed for the enjoyment of happiness, the Christian religion teaches us to believe, and the political creed of America fully coincides with the position. Isn't that remarkable? Issued in 1790, a very powerful expression of anti-slavery sentiment, a declaration that the natural rights of all people were violated by slavery. The petition is introduced to the House and Senate. Pro-slavery forces denounce it. The Senate takes no further action. The House sends it to a select committee and eventually tables the resolution. Tables means putting it to one side, and argued that the Constitution limited Congress's own power to end the slave trade until 1808. And that, in fact, that deadline is in the text of the Constitution itself. That ended the debate on slavery in the first Congress. But isn't that interesting also that Congress seemed to feel an obligation to respond to the petition? Franklin sent it, and rather than just ignoring it, as Congress does today, often when it's sent online petitions or Twitter petitions, Congress actually, in that case, the House formally tabled the petition. I'm going to tell you one more story, and then I'll stop and we can take stock, about anti-slavery petitions, which continued in the early 19th century. And they culminated in a really dramatic story involving John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was president of the United States, son of John Adams, one of only two father-son pairs who were president. We have also George, the Bush father and son. And between 1831 and 1836, anti-slavery forces led this huge petition drive against slavery, resulting in 100,000 petitions sent to the House of Representatives and Congress, mostly asking Congress to abolish slavery or restrict its expansion. John Quincy Adams is elected to the House after his presidency. He took the lead in introducing these petitions, and there's almost a riot in the House. The House leadership, which is driven by pro-slavery forces, imposes a gag rule limiting petitions. The rule automatically tabled anti-slavery petitions and prohibited them from being read or discussed. The argument was that Congress shouldn't act on them because the national government didn't have constitutional power to attack slavery in the states. Adams said the gag rule violated the First Amendment right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The petitions kept coming anyway, more than 1,500 in 1838 and 1839. And Congress eventually repudiated the gag rule as unconstitutional, and the House ended it by a vote of 108 to 80 in 1844. So that's the story, and it's a very dramatic example of how Congress itself got a chance to rule on the scope of the right of petition, and eventually concluded that gag rules restricting Congress's ability to respond to petitions violated the First Amendment. All right, Kerry, well, let's take stock.
Yeah, so great. So we understand kind of what the founding era thought. We pull that through to this idea that over time, people were able to utilize petition, especially to get voices into the lawmaking body that weren't always considered citizens. And this is what we talked a lot about in the last hour. Was it originally intended to be a way for everybody's voice to get into the government, or was this something that was used by many people? So we talked about enslaved people, Prince Hall, we talked about other people, but were there others that used the right to assemble and petition to be able to have their voice heard by the government?
Well, there certainly were, and the most dramatic example after African Americans and others who sought to abolish slavery were women. Friends, this is 2020. It's the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote in 1920. And there's a very dramatic and moving story of petitions, starting with the Seneca Fall Convention for Women, which argued that women, like African Americans, were entitled to the natural rights guaranteed in the Declaration of Independence. So at Seneca Falls in 1848, there was one of the most famous documents in American history, the Declaration of Sentiments, which used the language of the Declaration of Independence to argue that women and men were naturally entitled to equal citizenship. And that led to a series of petitions culminating in Alice Paul and other advocates of women's suffrage protesting in front of the White House. After Woodrow Wilson was reelected in 1916, Alice Paul called for members of the National Women's Party to picket the White House to put pressure on Democratic senators to vote for the 19th Amendment. They held up banners that drew on the Declaration of Independence. One said, "Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the government governed." Initially, President Wilson left the picketers alone, but then the police began arresting these women, and the women kept protesting and sending their petitions. And President Wilson eventually relented and supported the 19th Amendment in 1918, and it was ratified in 1920. So Justice Ginsburg has used a beautiful phrase. She says that the Constitution has constantly become more embracive. It has come to embrace previously excluded groups, African Americans, women, young people who got the right to vote by constitutional amendment. and others, and that many of those groups have exercised their right to petition and the right to assembly to ensure the securing of their constitutional rights.
So I think that's unbelievably interesting. And Jeff, I always like to point out and remind everybody that the first protest ever at the White House was women. Just going to own that one for women everywhere. Do you want to go to a couple hypotheticals, like can the government require groups looking to hold a permit for a parade or for a large protest like Occupy Wall Street? Would you like to try a couple hypotheticals with the crowd?
That's a great idea. And why don't we even make them not so hypothetical, but give actual
the real ones,
because
you got it. I can give you the real ones.
I've got them. Yeah, I've got them too. You put the case names up in the chat, and I'll just read them off. And friends, I want you to think about these, and then we'll vote on them and discuss them. But the first one is from the Cox case, Cox against New Hampshire. Can the government require that groups looking to hold a parade, protest, or other public gathering apply in advance for a permit? That's Cox versus New Hampshire. Now I'm going to read to you from Clark versus Community for Creative Nonviolence. Can the government prohibit large protests like Occupy Wall Street from sleeping overnight in public spaces like parks? Is sleeping overnight a form of protest protected by the First Amendment? Third, can the government require a privately owned St. Patrick's Day parade to include an organization of LGBTQ Irish Americans if it doesn't want to? That case was called Hurley versus Irish American Gay, Lesbian, and Bisexual Group of Boston. And the fourth and final case is called Terminiello. The government prevents someone from speaking because it fears that others will become so inflamed and outraged by their words that they'll turn to violence. That's the Terminiello case. We could go in reverse order, because why not? So let's start with that last case. Can the government prevent
keep us entertained?
Absolutely. Keeps me on my toes. Can the government prevent someone from speaking because it fears that others will become so inflamed and outraged by their words that they'll turn to violence? The case is Terminiello. We'll discuss it in a second, but let's have a preliminary vote.
And please feel free to vote before you look it up.
Yeah, don't look up. Right, because we want to discuss it.
That's why I like to pretend they're hypotheticals.
We're getting lots of no's. No, that prohibits freedom of speech. No, it depends, but I'm thinking yes. Well, that's good always to, I'm not sure. It's always a good answer. And
yeah,
Kerry put up the case citation. Most people are saying no. And indeed, you're right. That's what the Supreme Court held as well. And the court, in the Terminiello case, basically channeled a test that we talked about when we talked about freedom of speech. And that was the imminent danger test. So in a case called Brandenburg versus US, 1969, the court came up with the most powerful and significant protection for free speech in the entire world. It sounds hyperbolic, but it's not, because the US protects free speech more than any other country in the globe. It said that speech can only be banned if it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. Intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. And in the Terminiello case, the court came up with a test nearly that scrupulous. It wasn't quite phrased that way, but it was a case involving another preacher. His name was Father Arthur Terminiello. He delivered a rather nasty speech in which he attacked various political and racial groups, and he condemned the protesting crowd that was gathered outside the auditorium. The police couldn't prevent the disturbance by this crowd, and they arrested Father Terminiello for breach of the peace. And he's convicted for inciting a riot, because he's basically, the equivalent of Twitter bombing and hate speaking to these groups in public. And they said he incited a riot. Who wouldn't riot when they heard this hateful language? In a 5-4 ruling, the Supreme Court said that breach of the peace laws are unconstitutional when they're phrased that broadly. The court said that the vitality of civil and political institutions in our society depends on free discussion. And here's the test: speech can only be restricted when an event is likely to produce a clear and present danger of a serious substantive evil that rises far above public inconvenience, annoyance, or unrest. A lot of words in that sentence, but each of them is important. there has to be first of all, the speech has to be likely, not just possible, but likely to produce a clear and present danger. That sounds like an imminent danger. It's going to happen soon, not in the far off future, of a serious substantive evil, not just an ordinary bit of law breaking like jaywalking or turning without, putting on your turn signal, but a serious substantive evil like mass violence that rises far above public inconvenience, annoyance, or unrest. So the fact that the public is annoyed or even not restful, is disrupted, is sort of angry and grumbling and thinking, rah, we don't like this terrible speech. Even that's not enough. It's so important in a free society to produce robust, untrammeled freedom of speech that there has to be a clear and present danger of a serious substantive evil like violence, far more than public inconvenience and unrest. There's one other bit of doctrine that we can take from this important case, and that's this. In the US, there's no such thing as what's called a Hecklers Veto. In other words, if in Terminiello's speech, someone started standing up, or everyone started standing up and screaming and prevented him from being heard and didn't allow him to give his speech, even though his speech was hateful, that would be a violation of his First Amendment right to speak and the right of his audience to hear his speech. We had an example of this at the Constitution Center. We give these wonderful, meaningful, live discussions whenever the building is open, which unfortunately it's not right now. And a year or so ago, Charles Ramsey, the police chief of Philadelphia, former chief of DC, came to speak, and he was talking, and a group of Black Lives Matter, and they began to protest. And first they stood up silently and turned their backs, and that was great. That's exactly within their First Amendment rights to engage in that kind of peaceful, silent protest, and they were allowed to do that. But then the Park Police, who were responsible for taking care of the National Constitution Center, had to make a decision about when their protests became so disruptive that they rose to the level of a heckler's veto. And at a certain point, one of the protesters began shouting against Chief Ramsey, and the Park Police at that point decided he was exercising a heckler's veto, and they gently asked him to leave, and as it happened, he did leave. So it was an example of the First Amendment working the way it's supposed to. The protester was allowed to protest peacefully. As soon as it started to be a heckler's veto, he was asked to leave, and he did. That's exactly the way the First Amendment is supposed to work, and that's what the Terminiello case stands for.
So real quick, Jeff, and not to push us back in time, but just for a split second. So was that always something that our government, so with Terminiello, they said, yeah, you're allowed to have this speech as long as it doesn't cause imminent violence. But with the abolitionist movement and during the Civil War time, was that speech sometimes, the assembly, the gathering of people, the writing of petitions, was that sometimes stopped during the Civil War time? People who were trying to end slavery in America, was that speech considered unliked at the time and at times stopped?
Well, it certainly was. The Civil War period was a walking violation of the First Amendment by Southern states who literally forbade the mailing of abolitionist literature through the mail, there were these acts called the Negro Seamen's Acts, which meant that African-American sailors, even free sailors who would dock in Southern ports, had no right to speak. You couldn't teach enslaved people how to read. Andrew Jackson supported the Post Office Act of 1864, which asked postmasters to support these local censorship laws. Even in Philadelphia in 1835, there was a mass meeting which said that the actions of abolitionists in organizing societies, maintaining agents, and disseminating publications intended to operate on the institutions of the South are unwise, dangerous, and deserving emphatic reprehension and zealous opposition. So that's the opposite of the clear and present danger or the imminent danger test. It says that any speech that has a bad tendency to increase disrespect for the law, that is unwise or dangerous, can be banned. And it was. And this was so outrageous that Frederick Douglass, in a speech called A Plea for Free Speech in Boston in 1860, denounced mob leaders who suppressed abolitionist meetings and explicitly calls for respecting the rights of free speech and assembly. And then there's a wonderful coda to these rights, which is that the African-American conventions were formed where African-Americans themselves joined and sent petitions to have their free speech rights respected. And in 1865, Charles Sumner offered a petition to Congress from the newly freed slaves in South Carolina, calling for constitutional protection in keeping arms, in holding public assemblies, and in complete liberty of speech and of the press. So I'm so glad you asked that question, Kerry, because it reminds us that this modern test for free speech, which comes from cases like Terminiello in the 1940s and Brandenburg in the 1960s, is a 20th century achievement. And as late as the 19th century, many African Americans, women, and other dissenters had their speech rights and assembly rights suppressed by racist mobs.
And I think that's always really important about, sometimes we hear cases like Westboro Baptist, which, you know, is always my favorite one to talk about, but we hear about cases of people assembling under things that we might personally think are really wrong. But when you look at the abolitionist movement, you can tell, you say to yourself, how could that ever have been considered wrong? So when we look at the laws, it's not about the content. That, you know, it's not about why people are gathering in together, why people are assembling, what is their petition about, what is their speech about. It's about, is the government allowed to do that, and how we've played it out over time. And then it's not just a perfect arc towards freedom. So I love those stories to really compare speech we might like and speech we might not like, and what is to be protected during times. So do you want to go to the next scenario? Sorry, as I jump you back to the modern.
No, I think so. I think that's exactly right. And let's talk about the Hurley versus Irish American gay, lesbian, and bisexual group of Boston case. It's 1985. That's the one.
That's what I have.
Perfect. So I'll tell you the facts, and then I want you to vote without reading the case, and then we'll see if your mind changes after you see what the court did. So it's 1983. The South Boston Allied War Veterans Council is authorized by the city of Boston to organize a St. Patrick's Day parade. But this council refused to allow the Irish American gay, lesbian, and bisexual group of Boston to march. They basically said, we're veterans and we don't like gay people. We don't approve of them, and we don't want them in our parade. So the Massachusetts court ordered the council to include the group, relying on a state law banning discrimination based on sexual orientation in public accommodations. And the Massachusetts court basically said a parade is a public accommodation. The council, the veterans group that wanted to exclude the gay people, said that law violated their First Amendment rights of assembly. So we have a conflict between a First Amendment right of assembly and the state anti-discrimination law. How do you think the court resolved this conflict, or how should it be resolved? Everyone who thinks that the veterans group should have to include the gay and lesbian group in their parade, vote yes. And everyone thinks that the First Amendment protects the veterans group from having to allow the gay and lesbian group to march, vote no. Let's see what we got.
So I put the question in the chat if you want to read it as well before you vote, and just let the votes come in.
Absolutely. We're getting no's, sadly, says Sarah. And all the no's are basically saying that you don't have to allow the gay group into the parade if the veterans group doesn't want to include them. We're getting unanimous no's, and bravo, friends, because that's exactly what the Supreme Court held, and it held so unanimously. So you're exactly channeling the justices. All 9 justices concluded that the state court's ruling violated the First Amendment. The state can't require private citizens who organize a parade to include a group expressing a message that the organizers don't wish to convey. The court argued that this action violates the fundamental First Amendment right that a speaker has autonomy to choose the content of his own message, and conversely to decide what not to say. It was almost a form of compelled speech to be forced to insert into your parade a message with which you disagreed. It's a really interesting example of how the textual right of assembly, like that of petition, has merged into broader First Amendment doctrine protecting expressive advocacy or symbolic speech. And on our interactive constitution, which I'd love you all to check out after the talk, you'll find our two scholars saying that it would be good to resurrect more discrete and textually rooted assembly and petition rights rather than mushing them all together into a general free speech rights. But that's what the court held, and you were spot on in channeling it. We have just a few more minutes, I know, Kerry, but you want to start to?
Yeah, there was a couple points there that somebody brought up. Rebecca said, I got a little thrown because I was thinking about the Boy Scouts, because there's the question of the private organization, but a couple people brought this up, and I think it's a really good clarifying point, but it's on a public street. And I think that's where it kind of reckons your brain and saying, wait a minute, I get the private organization, but it's a public street. And so when the courts looked at this, they were looking at private organizations in public spaces.
Absolutely, because of course all assembly has to take place in public unless it's taking place in the home, where it's completely protected because events in your home have the highest protection. I'm standing in front of a fake backdrop of the National Constitution Center, but we had just a few weeks ago a group that wanted to come and protest against President Trump. And in order to do that, they had to apply to the National Park Service, which runs the beautiful Independence Mall that Kerry is standing behind. And the National Park Service said, you can certainly have a protest, but you have to stand, I can't really show you, kind of just under where my hands are. It would be in front of me on that part of the sidewalk. You can't stand behind me right in front of the National Constitution Center, because that would disrupt people from going into the Constitution Center. That was a valid time, place, and manner restriction. But the anti-Trump protest got the permit and they were allowed to protest. Now, if the Park Service then got a petition or a permit application from a group that wanted to have an anti-Bernie Sanders protest, and they declined that petition, but they granted the anti-Trump petition, that would be content discrimination. They couldn't do that. But generally, all of the great protest and parade cases take place in public property. The Skokie March involving neo-Nazis who wanted to march in Skokie was obviously in a public place, and courts there held that the Nazis were allowed to march in Skokie. Hateful message, public property, but this private group was allowed to assemble to express its message, and they were protected from doing that. And the Boy Scouts, similarly, although a private organization, were permitted to exclude gay scoutmasters until recently when they changed their policy on their own. So great reminder that it's the First Amendment binds government from restricting speech, but in the process of doing that, it protects the rights of private individuals and groups to use public property in order to express their messages.
So two questions from the group that have been popping in that I think are really interesting and kind of jump you around a little. But as we wrap up, I figured I'd sneak them in. So Paula brings up this question. Doesn't the petition clause also mean we have the right to challenge laws that we think are unreasonable? I often tell my students that many countries in the world do not allow that, but we can look at Griswold and Tinker to demonstrate that. So Paula also is from Boston and pointed out to us yesterday that her mayor pushed back on that that private parade and said, fine, you can do it, but I'm not speaking at it. So I thought, that's a great Brandeis, speech begets speech. So just wanted to add that in about Paula. Thanks for joining us, Paula.
Thank you, Paula. Great comment. And of course, you're absolutely right that cases like Griswold and Tinker and Friends, remember Griswold versus Connecticut is the case that struck down Connecticut's ban on a law forbidding married couples and others from using contraception. And Tinker was the famous armband case where Mary Beth Tinker wore a black armband protesting the Vietnam War. And the court said that your rights as students do not end at the schoolhouse door, and she, then a student, did have the right to do that. And Mary Beth Tinker herself was an example of using a protest with the armband, but she could just as well have written a petition to her representatives if there were laws that forbade wearing armbands in school. So what Paula reminds us is that there are many ways for us to mind our privilege, to mind the gap, to defend our rights. One way is to wear armbands and protest. Another way is to get our friends together and march in public and assemble. Yet another way is to file formal petitions to Congress and state legislatures. Yet another way today is, of course, to use social media. And the framers couldn't have thought about Twitter because there was no Twitter, but they certainly knew about petitions. And you can write stuff on Twitter and see if it's retweeted. You can even write petitions that are linked on Twitter and ask your friends to share it. You can do the same thing on Facebook. And it's a really interesting series of questions about whether, if Congress were to see a lot of these social media tweets or shares or posts that were basically petitions, should it have to respond in some way? Or can it just table the thing? Or can it just ignore them without taking any action at all? Do you actually formally have to address a petition to your representative for it to count as such? Or does a social media post count? And how can you try to challenge a law in court? You can join organizations that are set up to defend liberty, like the ACLU or the Beckett Fund, a civil libertarian, liberal and a conservative group that defend religious liberty. You can write articles and so forth. So Paula just reminds us something really important. Maybe this is a good note to close. Shall I wrap it up, Kerry? Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Sorry.
Here's the point, friends, and it's so important. What you're doing now is exactly what the framers hoped that you would do as citizens, which is to exercise your powers of reason, to learn about your rights, to mind your privileges, to defend, to guard your rights. Speak out on their behalf and speak out on whichever side you find most persuasive. It's so urgently important to listen to the arguments on both sides of these cases and decide which one you find more persuasive. There are few right answers in constitutional law. There are few unanimous decisions like that Hurley case. Usually you can argue these things one way or the other way, and whether you side more with that of the pastor who wants the right to assemble his church in Florida, or whether you side with the governor who wants to be able to restrict public gatherings, is up to you, based on learning about the text, history, structure, and Supreme Court case law, and exercising your powers of reason, just as the framers hoped. So we're going to end with the beautiful, inspiring words of Justice Louis Brandeis that has become a mantra for this series of conversations. Come, let us reason together. And the next time we can reason together is tomorrow, when Kerry and I get to interview Alex Coe, who's written this great new biography of George Washington called You Always Remember Your First. And if that sounds a little cheeky, it is. This is a very energetic, kind of no-holds-barred account of Washington, warts and all. It's supposed to be really great. I can't wait to talk to her and learn from her. I know Kerry is looking forward to it as well. So join us tomorrow at 1 to interview Alex Coe on George Washington. You always remember your first, and I hope that all of you remember, mind your rights.
I'm never going to forget it.
No, I won't either.
I love mind your privilege because it reminds us we are privileged and we do have these rights, but we have to use them. So I think that is not true for everybody in our society and everybody in the world. So I think I love that William Penn quote. And I think tomorrow is going to be so much fun that we get to, learn everything. I love warts and all about Washington. These people aren't fictitious superheroes. There's truth behind everything, and we want to learn about the whole person. So Jeff, thank you so much. Everybody online, thank you so much. We will see you tomorrow at 1, and I promise you to send you every case and every primary source that was mentioned today. Thank you all very much. Thanks, Jeff.
Great. Thank you, Kerry. See you tomorrow, everybody.